reason guardrails are there is because you can't always assume that everybody is an excellent driver.
Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories.
So here's my story. I was reading about the reactions to the last minute pardons by President Trump of various political affiliates and friends. And there's, depending upon which side of the political spectrum you're on, there's either outrage or an acknowledgement that that's within presidential power and he can do what he wants.
Which kind of seems to happen every term. I mean, like
it does.
People, there's always flack about who gets pardoned. And
I was going to hasten to point out that this is not just, President Trump breaking convention and he's evil, because almost every one of his predecessors has used the pardon power and gotten people upset. But I was reading about the time it was actually tested in the Supreme Court, meaning whether there was a limit to that power. And interestingly, the case came up when the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was William Howard Taft, who was the only president to actually then serve as Supreme Court Justice. And he wrote for the court in declining to put a limit on it. And this is the point I want to get to. It was for all of our Supreme Court groupies. It was in a case called Ex Parte Grossman. But I won't give the site because, whatever. So what he said was, and this is kind of the summary, that he saw the danger clearly of abusing the power of pardons. But he was certain that no president would ever be so corrupt as to issue bad pardons. And what his quote was is, "Our Constitution confers this discretion on the highest officer in the nation in confidence that he will not abuse it." And later, when he was interviewed, he said that basically he considered himself to be a gentleman, and he expected his successors to behave like gentlemen too. So when he was viewing this power, he was assuming the same basic core values that he believed would be important in holding the office of the presidency. So he really saw no possibility that somebody without those core values would occupy it.
That's so interesting. And it makes me think of so many situations, like the conversations and decisions where, and on both ends of the spectrum, about how to over and underdo rules or regulations of some kind, right? Like, I mean, there's an inherent flaw, I think, in his reasoning, in that if that were the case, like, oh, we don't need a rule about this thing because people will have these same values. Well, then you wouldn't need any rules about anything, right? I mean, like
nobody's going to murder somebody.
Like the entire world's on the honor system.
Yes.
Nobody's going to do anything bad or selfish or wrong because we have morals or whatever. So there's definitely a thing there, but it is just, I think there's often just as many times, because here's something that has come up a lot where we'll be talking about, I'll be facilitating a conversation, especially when an organization is growing up through that phase where they do start to need to have more regulations or more things defined. And they'll often be thinking of what those rules are, how they structure things based on who's in those positions right now.
Right.
Well, Kevin would never, so we don't need to. I'm like, right, but what? And I literally say, but what if bad Kevin was what if evil Kevin had the next role? Like, what do you need to worry about? You at least need to think about what's at risk if somebody was not trustworthy, or if good Kevin's life took a turn where suddenly he now had different rules because he was desperate about a thing. You just kind of have to think about the outer bounds. So a lot of times it's making sure that you aren't under setting the rules and structure just because, you're assuming the best intentions. But I think it's also really risky that you go the other direction and over stipulate rules because you're imagining that everyone's a crook and a criminal and that we have to protect from this, that, and the other and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, I see that in a couple places. One is in job descriptions. So
that's interesting.
You have companies that say, look, I don't want to write out job descriptions because everybody knows what their job is and they just do their jobs. And I'm really afraid that if I write out job descriptions, meaning I put too many rules in there, that if I write out job descriptions, then people are going to go, well, I know I normally do that, but that's not in my job description, so I'm going to stop. So we don't want to do that because we work really well without these rules and without these confines because they're looking at their present team.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't want to mess with that at all. So sometimes it's not just, well, if we don't say you can't steal, then somebody's going to raid the petty cash drawer every day. It's just a matter of, well, are we, like you said, you make rules for the people who are in there at the present time. And sometimes that goes wildly off the rails when you grow. And you realize that, the team is going to expand beyond that core number of people who started the company.
Well, there's also another level to which, especially if I'm working with a team that's hesitant about putting rules in because they feel like it's almost disrespectful or taking, well, we don't want, we keep using Kevin. We don't want Kevin to feel like we're looking over his shoulder or that we don't trust him or those kinds of things. And I think the other really important thing is when done at the right level, those things actually protect Kevin. They keep Kevin from ever being called to question. Like there have been times where I've been in positions where I say, well, we don't need to look at that. I'm like, oh, no, I want you to look over my shoulder on this because I don't want there to ever be, it actually protects me for there to be another level of oversight or some kind of a second, a second signer on checks or whatever it is. And that way there's never any question of where it is. So let's get back to what kind of the original question though. I do think it comes back to, here's how I think of it is what's at risk? What's at worst risk? I'm saying that terribly. Words would be nice here. Like, what's the maximum threat level of that thing? And therefore, does it warrant extra rules?
Well, sometimes the maximum threat level is like in the original story, the issuance of bad pardons, people who will get away with breaking the law and cronies will be rewarded, et cetera. But sometimes in a company, the maximum threat level isn't that stark, but it's a slow erosion of culture.
Mm-hmm.
So to give you an example, and this is something I can't decide whether it's a good thing or a bad thing about what I do in my firm, which is I've had this constant tension about paid time off, meaning specifically tracking paid time off, because I'll have people come to me and say, hey, do you mind if I take half a day and do this, go wherever, visit family or something. And I like and respect all of the people who work for me. And I know that none of them really would take advantage of it. And so I don't like the image of being a person kind of with a sharp pencil and a ledger and going, oh, well, now that's 4 hours against what you should have worked. I don't like that. And I do have, and I have had people say in the past, no, you really got to track that. You got to at least track it. But on my way of looking at it, there are times, rare times, but there are times when I've had to say, hey, look, I know it's a Saturday, or I know that it's after 5 o'clock or whatever it is, but I really need you. Would you mind doing this or would you mind doing that? And things, that are a bit outside job description. Look, my lawyers and apparently and the whole team, they deliver eggnog. That's not really in their job description.
Right. But it's really good eggnog, so.
Yeah. And it's the clients and things like that. But I feel that if I start meticulously tracking that this one owes me 20 minutes and that one owes me 4 hours, then I think that everybody naturally will balance the scales and say, well, okay, that's what you expect of us, fair, you're paying us. But, if I go out here, or if I have to come in to help pack up to move the office or do whatever, that's a Saturday. That's not really my time. I'm going to just do that on our
Right.
During the workday. And so I tend to be on the loose side of the rules, because I do expect that everybody's going to act fairly much within our core values and our culture.
It reminds me a tiny bit of a company I was working with where there was the question of overtime, like, should we get paid overtime? And they said, well, so just think, there's a bigger question of overtime when it's like a lot, but there is a decision about the culture of a company, because if you want us to become a company where if you're here one more hour, you get paid for that hour, then we have to be the company where at 8:30, when the clock starts, you are at your desk working. And like, you can't have this, we're trusting you to get your work done in your day. And if you want to take an hour in the middle of the day and work the crossword puzzle, we're assuming it all gets where you can't have that both ways. And either one can work. Like, it's a choice, but you have to pick a bit of a swim lane there. And they're not completely mutually exclusive, but there is, you can't really have all of both those things at once. And I think interestingly, the Goldilocks, a lot of these things are about finding that Goldilocks sweet spot in the middle where it's working, it's not inhibiting any behavior that you want to see more of, but it's also not encouraging behavior that you want to see less of. And so I've had people say, well, we really need to like have vacation tracked down to the penny, because what if somebody's, abusing it and they're gone too much? I'm like, well, okay. So first step with that is a conversation. Talk to Stan about the fact that he's taking a lot of vacation. It doesn't have to be a policy that then everybody needs to. I will say, though, I have encountered people for whom if it's not tracked, if they're not clear where, like how much time they have, or if it's okay, if they can't see that they have a bank of 30 hours and that's theirs, they won't take it because they're afraid of coming. Not only will they not abuse their 30 hours, they'll never get past, like they'll always have 10 or 15 in the bank just to make sure that they're. And so if they can't see it, they won't use it. And so those are kind of the edges to watch out for, I think, in rules of making sure you're not, I guess that's the point. The edge of all the rules have issues.
Well, and there's another one, and that is on the legal side. I recently had a situation where I was working with a small company, and they had one of those get your work done during the day policies, because they were construction companies. So they had a number of crews out on projects, but in the office, they had maybe 7 people, so it wasn't an overwhelming number of people, and everybody knew the names of everybody's kids. It's one of those types of companies. And they let somebody go because they closed out one of their divisions. So they had to let a longtime employee go. And then 2 years later, that employee came back and said, oh, wait a minute, you didn't pay me overtime for these times that I stayed. And my clients were like, well, she would bring in her grandkids and take 2 hours in the middle of the day. And that was fine. I mean, because she got her work done. And other times, but she came back and said, but, I did work, after 8 hours or whatever it was. And I never got overtime. And so that became a problem as well.
Oh, yeah. No, well, like so many episodes we have done, it comes back to expectations. If you're doing the calculus and saying, oh, well, she brings in her grandkids and da-da-da-da-da, and the other lady's calculating, the other side of the conversation is racking up their overtime that they're going to get paid. Both are using actual factual data.
Yes.
But they have different expectations of what happened. I had a terrible situation where when I was helping run that company for a couple of years on the side, we had somebody leave, and on her parting day, she hands me this envelope of receipts, like random receipts for like all these things. And I was like, what is this? And it was like $1,500 worth of stuff. And
Like
she's like,
for things she bought?
gas receipt.
Oh,
And now, meanwhile, the company had a gas card that was available for use. You're using.
yeah.
She's like, well, those were times that I didn't have the card with me, so I just filled it on my own thing. And it was such a it was one of those moments where all the things that you proudly say on things like your podcast or to clients about like what not to do, make sure expectations are clear and that and that no one's confused. You're like, oh, I'm doing such a bad job of doing the right things here because this clearly wasn't clear. And she was expecting that $1,500. Like her calculus was that was owed to her. And I really struggled with that because some of these receipts went back like 2 and 3 years. And like, I don't even know if these were your gas receipts. For all I know, you were at the bar and said, anybody got a gas receipt? Throw it in the envelope. I mean, I don't know. And it was one of those times where the talk you talk really gets landed by the walk you just walked. And you're like, oh, learning that one the hard way.
Right. And so one of the things that I see, and again, on the legal side, is that people decide that they want to run the company without as many rules, but then they want to put down policies like because they feel they should have, for example, a personnel manual or they should have certain rules, but they don't even know what those rules say. And it kind of reminds me of like the employee that presented you with the receipts. I had a situation where one of my clients was presented with, another claim for overtime. But one of the things that I thought was funny was that in this person's claim for overtime, they cited the fact that they routinely worked on Arbor Day. And so my client said, what the hell everybody works on? I don't even know when Arbor Day is. I couldn't even in a month.
Is the employee a druid?
But what the employee said is, well, if you look at our personnel manual, it lists times that we get off and Arbor Day is in there. And sure enough, my guy was like, I don't know who drafted this thing. I don't know if it was a joke that they put that in. But
that's hysterical.
We never looked at the actual pages because we're a small company. Nobody really followed it. And so I think it was just a joke that was in there, but sure enough, it was in there.
I have such a love-hate relationship with the entire concept of like policy manuals. Like I get that stuff has to be documented because if you start at a new place and you can't somehow find how things work or what you're supposed to do, that's hard. And you don't want to just go by word of mouth from Sally across the aisle that that's how things work. And then you get in trouble and you're like, but Sally said. I mean, so I get that there's a need for them, but I just so often, for exactly what you just said, small company, we threw one out there because we were supposed to have one, but no one actually read it. Well, then don't have one. And the number of times that I've seen them created solely to avoid a hard conversation, like, well, we don't want to, somebody's abusing the vacation policy or presumably abusing the vacation policy. But don't forget, if it isn't in writing, it maybe wasn't clear. So they might think that they are. We had that happen back in my architecture days. We did it a little bit differently. It wasn't, I know some places, I think at the time you get like 2 weeks vacation. Some places when you start, you get your 2 weeks vacation and that is available to you, maybe not immediately, but it comes in a bulk each year at the turn of a clock, boom, you get that 2 weeks. Right. We did it on the like accrual basis. Like every month you accrued like 6.67 hours or something, whatever it was. And, the fact that that is in my brain, by the way, that I cannot remember critical information about my children, but I am pretty sure it's 6.67 hours that we would accrue. That's data from like 25 years ago. Anyway, 20 years ago. So, and we had an employee who hadn't quite understood that and was taking vacation. They weren't really abusing it. They just misunderstood that they were accruing it like hours each month or whatever. So.
But sometimes it does, it can also protect you. Like in your receipt example, if they had something in the manual that said that you'll be reimbursed for receipts provided that they're turned in within 2 weeks of the expense being incurred, or provided that if they're over X amount, you would have gotten prior authorization, or these are the types of expenses we'll reimburse for. So it has to be thought out. But I think that the larger point, that I took away from some of the things you're saying is that there's a way to navigate between President Taft's talk about, well, no bad person will ever do this. So you don't necessarily have to provide in your rules that you might hire a serial killer, and so you have to put in there that, well, we don't kill our coworkers.
Right.
But
right.
You certainly should look to whether any of our policies can be misunderstood, so that somebody or that a reasonable person and an ethical person could decide to do X when we really thought it was Y.
Right. So, but it was funny because when you were talking about the submit receipts, as long as they're within 2 weeks or whatever, let's be honest, there's a tiny bit of leadership, or especially if you're growing a company where all this stuff just doesn't exist when you got there the first day. That's a little bit like parenting, where I didn't realize I had to tell you not to put Legos up your nose. I never meant, you're right. I never mentioned that because I didn't think that needed to be said. And in that moment, I felt a little bit like it had just never, what's the phrase? A failure of imagination. It had never occurred to me that someone would be hoarding receipts from 3 years back that they were imagining that we would just make good on. And some of the things on her list were like cash. Well, I bought whatever. And the things I'm like, you probably did, but just from an IRS standpoint, I there's no receipt. There's no cash. You're just saying like, I used 20 of my dollars to buy envelopes for the office or whatever. I'm like, well, I just never occurred to me somebody would think that was okay. And so I would have never in a million years put that in a policy manual until now. Much like now that I've done it, I'm like, oh, we should probably have a stipulation about that.
But then, of course, you still run into that. If you put in that rule and you say that we'll reimburse you provided it's a company expense and you turn it in within 2 weeks of incurring that expense, and somebody comes in and goes, hey, look, I got really tied up. I forgot about this. I know it's 3 weeks old and the policy says 2, but can you still reimburse me? And I'm speaking as somebody who runs my own very small company where I know I'd be hard pressed to go, check the calendar. I believe that, so then you get into, all right, well, we have this rule, which is routinely violated or kind of whitewashed in some way. And so when do you stop whitewashing? If you're like, okay, well, I'll let them go over it. Look, it says 2 weeks, but 3 weeks is fine. And then somebody's like, hey, look, last month I did this. I know it's 5 weeks, but you're like, okay. I mean, I know I did it for so-and-so, so I'll do it for you. So then you still get into the issue of not only putting the rules down that anticipate issues you're going to have to deal with, but also whether or not you're going to be able to look somebody in the eye and enforce something that is adverse to them.
Well, so I think, and this is probably going to make your lawyer skin crawl, because I know that when companies become of a certain size, you no longer have this kind of flexibility, or even less so. Maybe you don't technically have this flexibility when you're small. But I feel like rules are there to put guardrails on things, but you can always step over the guardrail whenever you want. I mean, I could accept receipts back from 3 years if I felt like there was a legitimate reason. It gives me a way to more solidly say no if I feel like it's the wrong reason. I mean, if somebody came to me and said, oh my God, I don't know what I stuck this receipt. I thought I turned this receipt in. I even have the copy, but apparently I didn't. I just found it under my car seat. And there's somebody who, and this is the part that I know is not, somebody who's really, given it all to the company and whatnot. You can make exceptions as you want, but it's harder to draw. Like I really struggled to draw the line with the lady who handed me the envelope because there were no rules to back me up on why that wasn't okay. I had nothing to stand on other than, I don't like how this feels.
No, you can. You absolutely have the discretion to make exceptions. The problem is when you make exceptions for one person, but then you decide that an exception is not warranted for the second person.
Right. I know. That's why I said this part will make your skin.
Well,
Wait, playing favorites isn't a good leadership tactic?
Well, look, and I know I told you this story that, one of my clients, this goes back a little ways, one of my clients just let somebody go in the ordinary course of their business, and they received a lawsuit for wrongful termination. And what the lawsuit alleged is that my client had fired this person because she's a Methodist. And my client called me up, and the first question he asked was, "What the hell is a Methodist?" And then the second question is, how would I
Methodist?
Yeah, how would I know if this person was a Methodist? But the point is
kind of like hating beige as a color.
Yeah, I mean, but the point is, and believe it or not, I do have a story about that, but about the beige thing. But the point is, though, that regardless of whether you, in a given situation, were reasonable in making an exception for person A, but in enforcing the rules for person B, if person B became aggrieved, that person may be able to seek out a nefarious reason that you made the exception. Oh, I see that you made the exception, but only for people of this race or this religion or people who look like you or whatever it is, when that may not have been anywhere close to the consideration, but it does heighten the risk.
That's so. I actually grew up Methodist, and I've never heard it called out as it's sort of in the glommy glue of just general Protestant Christianity.
I had no idea. I knew it was part of Christianity, but we were kind of laughing about that because we're like, of all the reasons that you're accusing us of firing somebody, that seems...
Because what's funny is Catholicism is part of Christianity, but at least there's like this history of like I could see that's because I'm Catholic. Like there's more of a historic ire based on, whatever. But Methodist is like the milk toastiest of it's just nothing like what?
Yeah.
I can't imagine because you had too many potluck dinners. Was that it?
Right. But the point is, people can conjure up a reason that they received an adverse decision, whereas somebody in the desk across the way did not.
Right. So I feel like the wisdom that we are really honing in on here is good luck with rules.
You should have them. Probably.
Maybe you should probably have them, but you may or may not want to enforce them, and don't overdo them, but also don't underdo them. And good luck with that.
I see you've read my book. Yes.
It's really not that helpful. I think what I take from it is that it shouldn't be something that's just done. When you are making rules, when you're making decisions about where you are going to draw the lines, whether it's about making the rule or enforcing the rule, that it requires some thought and some nuanced thought and some awareness and some consideration, that where it really goes wrong is when things are just plopped down or just thrown out because we should have a rule about that. And therefore any rule will do. I've had clients download a template policy manual.
Yeah.
And not take the time to go through. I guarantee that's how your Arbor Day thing probably got put in there, because you're like, oh, we'll look at that part later. Barely touched it, and then feel some sort of weird sense of security of like, oh, now we've done the right thing. We have a policy manual. I'm like, yeah, but what is it saying? What if it says that you have to, I don't know, make up some ridiculous, egregious rule that you just agreed to?
Yeah, no, I think that the wisdom is that guardrails are good, but they have to be well-reasoned and well thought out, appropriate to circumstances. And I think they have to be, they're probably going to be tempered with a reasonable amount of discretion. There's got to be goodwill on both sides. And I think there has to be communication and buy-in. So there's nothing wrong with on the vacation or on the holidays to sit down and say, look, this is what I'm thinking on this. Like we have a joke in our office, that, we give certainly the day after Christmas and the Friday after Thanksgiving is fine. But years ago, I don't know why it got me so irritated, but I kept saying that, July 3rd is not a holiday. So, and this has become kind of a running joke in our office, because if July 4th is on a Saturday, I remember we had a secretary years and years and years ago was like, well, then we should have Friday off. I'm like, no, because July 3rd is not a holiday. And neither is July 5th. But the point is that people have different ways of looking at things. And so you have to sit down and have that discussion and buy in. So at least people are not presented on either side of the equation with an unexpected guardrail.
Well, so I want to come back to the guardrail metaphor before we wrap up here. But I will say that the other benefit to holidays, and I think it's worth thinking things through, even though you're correct, July 3rd is not a holiday. The other thing too is to space out where the holidays are in the year. Like, if there is a need for a break mid-July, like a day, then it has value that way. And I have a very funny, very embarrassing story about choosing holidays that really speaks to our ignorance and youthfulness when we were growing the architecture firm. That I'll tell another day. But I want to go back to, it's really embarrassing. I want to go back to the guardrail thing, because actually, if you really step into that metaphor and really pick it apart, it has a lot of guidance in it. So guardrails they're not just on both sides of the road forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever. Like, that's really like hard, rigid rules. There are places where there are exit ramps and entrance ramps. Those are like exceptions. There are places where you don't need guardrails because there's nothing, like there aren't guardrails everywhere on every highway. They put them where there are risks of like careening over a cliff. Right, exactly. Off the side of a mountain, or I grew up in West Virginia. There's lots of places where there's only guardrails on one side of the road. If you're on the side of a mountain, or you're on a mountain road, you don't need a guardrail on the side where the mountain essentially is the guardrail, unless there's a ditch. So if you really think about all the ways guardrails are used and where they're put in place and where they're not put in place, and where they're reinforced, and where, like, on certain I'm having a lot of fun with this now, like where there's like the Jersey barriers where you need more than a guardrail. You actually need like a hardcore barrier. I think there's a lot of wisdom there in how you think about rules, because that really displays a lot of the adaptability and flexibility and nuance about where you need guardrails and where you don't.
Right. And I agree with that. I also would say that the reason guardrails are there is because you can't always assume that everybody is an excellent driver.
Now I want to know what the rumble strips.
So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories. You can find links to that group, as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email, and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us.
Which
is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.